All right, SIG 23. This is it's 21 December 2020. This is the other half of that. I ran out of time, but here we are. According to recent polls, such hesitancy is understandably most prevalent among African Americans, the group that has most commonly been used as human guinea pigs by the U.S. government and associated scientific and medical institutions. For instance, there are the infamous Tuskegee University experiments devised by the U.S. Public Health Service, now a division of HHS, and the CDC. The unwitting participants in the study, all of whom were African American, were told that they were receiving free healthcare services from the federal government, while actually they were being intentionally untreated for syphilis so government scientists could study the devastating progression of the disease. That's awfully nice. Deception was critical to the experiment, as the participants did not know that they were part of an experiment at all and were also kept unaware of their true diagnosis. While Tuskegee may be the most well-known example of racist medical experimentation in the U.S., it's far from the only one. For example, during the Manhattan Project, the undertaking that produced the atom bomb, the U.S. government contracted dozens of physicians to inject unknowing hospital patients with up to 4.7 micrograms of radioactive plutonium, 41 times the normal lifetime exposure. The goal of this experiment was to pinpoint the dosage at which radioactive elements such as plutonium would cause illnesses like leukemia, and to measure the amount of radioactivity that lingers in the blood, tissues, bones, and urine. Between 1944 and 1994, the Atomic Energy Commission supported thousands of experimental projects sanctioning such radiation on human subjects, most of whom were African Americans. From 1954 to 1962, the Sloan Kettering Institute, which receives hundreds of millions of dollars of NIH funds annually, injected over 400 African American inmates at Ohio State Prison with live cancer cells to observe how the body might destroy them. The primary sponsor for this research was the National Institutes of Health, which also partially sponsored the Tuskegee experiments. From 1987 through 1991, U.S. researchers administered as much as 500 times the approved dosage of the Edmonton Zagreb or EZ measles vaccine to African American and Latino babies in low-income Los Angeles neighborhoods as part of a vaccine experiment. Consent forms did not inform parents of the increased dosage or of the fact that the vaccine was experimental. Parents were also not informed that the vaccine had already been given to 2,000 children in Haiti, Senegal, and Guinea-Bissau with disastrous results. For example, in Senegal, children who received the jab died at a rate of 80% higher than children who did not receive it. The CDC would later characterize the U.S. trials as clearly a mistake. No kidding. Between 1992 and 1997, so not really that long ago, Columbia University's Lowenstein Center for the Study and Prevention of Childhood Disruptive Behavior Disorders conducted studies that sought to establish a link between genetics and violence, focusing on minority children in New York City. These experiments targeted 126 boys between the ages of 6 and 10, 100% of whom were either African American, Latino, or biracial. In exchange for $100 and a $25 Toys R Us gift card, the children, selected because of their older brothers had come into contact with the juvenile probation system, were taken from their homes, denied food and water, and given a drug called fenfluramine. Prior to these experiments, fenfluramine had never been administered to people under the age of 12. and it was already known that the drug was associated with heart valve damage, brain damage, and death. Such historical facts raise obvious questions about the reasons for vaccine hesitancy and how they are currently being approached by the U.S. government and related institutions. While it would make the most sense to combat this problem by holding to account the people responsible for past abuses such as those described above, the opposite has been the case. Instead, the CHS and other institutions, particularly regarding the coming COVID-19 vaccination campaign, have proposed several other means of combating vaccine hesitancy, ranging from deception to information warfare to economic coercion. Given the long-standing exploitive relationship between U.S. medicine and ethnic minorities, the August interim framework addresses the situation that communities of color, and in particular black populations, quote, may be more wary of officials responsible for vaccine-related decisions due to past medical injustices. You think? It states, anticipate hesitancy among marginalized populations who may be fearful or wary of seeking vaccination at sites that have historically caused mistrust. Another CHS paper published in July titled The Public's Role in COVID-19 Vaccinations, which is cited heavily in the August framework, acknowledged the U.S. legacy of experimentation on black men and women. However, the CHS document also notes that more than one COVID-19 vaccine candidate may be available at the same time, and they may have different safety and efficacy profiles across different population groups and may have different logistical requirements. It adds that it is also possible that certain adverse effects may occur more frequently in certain population subgroups, which may not be apparent until millions are vaccinated. It is notable that Palantir, the CIA-linked government technology contractor, has been put in charge of creating the software that will, quote-unquote, decide which population subgroups are given the vaccine. Are given what vaccine? Palantir is perhaps best known for its controversial role in targeting undocumented immigrants, illegals, through its contracts with ICE and its role in predictive policing efforts that disproportionately targeted African Americans. It is certainly unsettling that those same ethnic groups that Palantir is most controversial for targeting on behalf of the national security state and law enforcement are the same critical populations that the company will initially identify for the U.S. military-led COVID-19 vaccination program, Operation Warp Speed. In addition, in a move that can only aggravate minority community vaccine hesitancy, the August CHS interim framework recommends that the CDC transform the current vaccine adverse event reporting system from a voluntary system that relies on individuals sending in reports to the government to an active surveillance system that monitors all vaccine recipients, possibly via unspecified electronic mechanisms. Huh, really? Okay. First it's voluntary, and now they want involuntary. Active surveillance system, all right. The Last American Vagabond reported last month that Operation Warp Speed, seemingly having taken a cue from the interim framework, plans to utilize, quote, incredibly precise tracking systems that will ensure that patients each get 2 doses of the same vaccine and to monitor them for adverse health effects. Those systems will be managed in part by the intelligence-linked tech giants Google and Oracle. I feel better already. The main stated purpose of these tracking systems, referred to in other Warp Speed documents as pharmacovigilance systems, is to monitor the longer-term effects of the new unlicensed vaccine production methods that are being used in the production of every Warp Speed COVID-19 vaccine candidate. These vaccines, per Warp Speed's own documents, state that these methods have limited previous data on safety in humans, the long-term safety of these vaccines will be carefully assessed using pharmacovigilance surveillance in phase 4 or post-licensure clinical trials following the administration of the COVID-19 vaccines to the prioritized critical populations. Given the above, the unprecedented facets of the warp speed COVID-19 vaccination plan, that is, its focus on ethnic minorities as the first to receive the experimental COVID-19 vaccine, its interest in giving different vaccine candidates to different population groups, and studying the largely unknown effects through tracking systems and unspecified electronic mechanisms are all things that would obviously further fuel mistrust by those ethnic groups that have historically been targets of medical experimentation by the US government. Furthermore, that COVID-19 vaccine development and distribution efforts are being spearheaded by the military and national security apparatus, as well as having the intimate involvement of controversial contractors such as Palantir, will likely exacerbate minority distrust as Operation Warp Speed advances, given that these same groups are those most often found to be on the receiving end of militarized state violence. Also concerning is that law enforcement, military, and Department of Homeland Security officials will no longer be priority vaccine allocation targets. For the first time since the 2001 anthrax attacks, while no convincing reason for their exclusion is offered. Yet instead of honestly addressing these unprecedented recommendations, the effort to get around the vaccine hesitancy issue as it relates to minorities plans to rely on tactics that avoid addressing any of these issues directly. In one example, although the August interim framework recommends directly prioritizing ethnic minorities, it recognizes that doing so could further threaten the fragile trust that some have in the medical and public health system, particularly if there's the perception that there has been a lack of testing to assess vaccine safety and that they are guinea pigs. I mean, because all the above is true. The document also states that the implementation of directly prioritizing communities of color could also be challenging and divisive, as determining how to access specific populations and how to determine eligibility based on race or ethnicity includes many sensitive challenges. As a workaround to such concerns, the CHS suggests that prioritizing other cohorts of the population, such as essential workers or those with underlying health conditions associated with poorer COVID-19 outcomes, could also indirectly help address the disproportionate burden of this pandemic on communities of color, due to the high representation of those minorities in the essential workforce. The document continues, while this approach might avoid some of the challenges outlined above, it would also need to be implemented in a way that ensures vaccines are equitably distributed across subcategories of these categories. Thus, it suggests prioritizing those individuals and groups who face both severe health and severe economic risks, specifically essential workers at higher risk of severe illness or whose household members are at higher risk, who will suffer severe economic harm if they stop working. Those groups at higher risk of severe illness, the document later notes, are incidentally ethnic minorities. In other words, the strategy proposed by the CHS to specifically prioritize cohorts of the U.S. population that contain high proportions of ethnic minorities without directly prioritizing those minorities in order to somewhat deceptively, although avoid exacerbating vaccine hesitancy concerns among those groups by directly singling them out. Yeah, it's called a workaround. The interim framework acknowledges the high prevalence of ethnic minorities in the essential workforce and cites a paper published in April 2020 by the Center for Economic and Policy Research that notes that people of color are overrepresented in many occupations with frontline industries. In addition to prioritizing essential workforce cohorts, which have a high percentage of ethnic minorities, the CHS document also suggests that prisoners, another group where ethnic minorities are heavily overrepresented, and, quote, undocumented immigrant communities of color, spare me, should also be prioritized. Like the essential workforce strategy, this would ensure increased vaccine uptake by ethnic minorities without prioritizing them directly. It's also worth noting that in addition to the focus on ethnic minorities, the interim framework also recommends that differently abled and mentally challenged populations who can experience difficulties in accessing healthcare and could be in higher risk living settings such as assisted living facilities be included as a target population along with ethnic minorities. This strategy is laid out by the CHS. This strategy, as laid out by the CHS, appears to have been embraced by the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, which is the official government body that will designate the target populations of the COVID-19 vaccination strategy. Also in August, Kathleen Dooling, a CDC epidemiologist, writing on behalf of ACIP and COVID-19 vaccines work group, stated that groups for early phase vaccination should be those that overlap with first, those with higher risk medical conditions, second, essential workers, and third, adults over 65. As previously noted, the essential workforce is predominantly composed of ethnic minorities. Notably, the high-risk medical conditions listed in the same document are conditions that are all significantly more prevalent among ethnic minorities, such as type 2 diabetes, obesity, chronic kidney disease, and serious heart conditions, and sickle cell disease. Cancer is also listed, and while prevalent across the U.S. population at large, the incidence of cancer is highest among African Americans. Particularly notable is the inclusion of sickle cell disease, as African Americans in the U.S. have a much higher probability of having that condition than any other group. According to 2010 data analyzed by the CDC, the sickle cell gene, which is necessary in both parents for a child to inherit sickle cell disease, is present in 73 per 1,000 African American newborns compared to 3 per 1,000 Caucasian newborns. Wow, that's a hell of a difference, 73 versus 3. The overlap strategy fits with current CDC ACIP guidelines for vaccine recommendations, which hold that if vaccination supply is limited, the CDC should reduce the extra burden the disease is having on people already facing disparities. Reduce the extra burden, okay. The overlap strategy, as laid out in the recent ACIP COVID-19 vaccines work document, however, has the inevitable end result of ensuring that the vast majority of those who will first receive the experimental COVID-19 vaccine will be ethnic minorities over the age of 65 and ethnic minorities in the essential workforce. Also noteworthy in relation to the prioritization of ethnic minorities is that in March, the government interpreted federal regulations to grant liability immunity to any entity producing, distributing, manufacturing, or administering COVID-19 countermeasures, including vaccines. According to HHS, this may also provide immunity from certain liability under civil rights laws, meaning that those involved with the COVID-19 vaccination campaign may not be liable if found to violate the rights of groups protected under civil rights law, that is, ethnic minorities. Controlling the narrative, another tactic promoted by the CHS. as well as the CDC and Warp Speed to combat vaccine hesitancy, is aggressive communication strategies that include saturating, in quotations, the media landscape with pro-vaccine content while greatly reducing content deemed to promote vaccine hesitancy. The national security state, which is managing Operation Warp Speed, has become increasingly involved in this media effort, particularly by censoring content that is considered to be anti-vaccine, including, in their view, news outlets critical of the pharmaceutical industry and vaccine manufacturers, by using counter-terror tools that have previously been used to disrupt online terrorist propaganda. Oh, all right. After the 2019 coronavirus pandemic simulation, I love that. It's convenient that you have the 2019 coronavirus pandemic simulation. 10 months after the CARES Act was introduced into Congress, January the 24th or 25th of 2019, more than a year before it was actually signed in March of 2020. So, after the October 2019 coronavirus pandemic simulation, really convenient, Event 201, the CHS issued a statement that media companies have a responsibility to ensure that authoritative messages are prioritized. The CHS had co-sponsored Event 201 alongside the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's much more to this information war than just the rapidly accelerating online censorship effort. For instance, the official Operation Warp Speed document entitled From the Factory to the Front Lines notes that strategic communications and public messaging are critical to ensure maximum acceptance of vaccines, requiring a saturation of messaging across the national media. It also states that working with established partners, especially those that are trusted sources for target audiences, is critical to advancing public understanding of, access to, and acceptance of eventual vaccines, and that identifying the right messages to promote vaccine confidence, countering misinformation, and targeting outreach to vulnerable and at-risk populations will be necessary to achieve high coverage. The document also notes that Warp Speed will employ the CDC's three-pronged strategic framework known as Vaccinate with Confidence for its communications thrust. The third pillar of that strategy is called Stop Myths and has as a main focus establishing partnerships to contain the spread of misinformation, as well as working with local partners and trusted messengers to improve confidence in vaccines. Like the official Warp Speed guidance, the CDC interim framework also sees community outreach as an essential element for a successful vaccine campaign and suggests funding and training community health workers to promote vaccination specifically to underserved, disproportionately affected groups. It details how the U.S. government might engage African Americans, Latino Americans, lower income populations to build trust in connection with vaccine recommendations and get around concerns that they are testing subjects for a novel vaccine. The CHS document notes, for example, the importance of cultural competence when promoting vaccines, advising that vaccinating at churches, schools, and culturally specific community centers or senior centers might sit better with marginalized populations and make them feel more at ease. Such considerations were further elaborated on by Luciana Borio in September. That month, the vice president of InQtel and member of Biden's transition team wrote that while it may be appropriate to use military resources for vaccination efforts, any such federal engagement must be done in a collaborative manner sensitive to public perceptions that may be engendered by having a public health function fulfilled by individuals in uniform. I'm going to cut this one off here, and I'll finish up with part 3.